The moment Beatrice Grady crossed the finish line, 3 lengths ahead of the finest horseman in 3 territories, the crowd at the Cimarron Flats Fairgrounds went so quiet you could hear the dust settling back to earth. It was the summer of 1878, deep in the New Mexico territory, and the air smelled of horse sweat and sun-baked clay, and the kind of reckless possibility that only existed out on the frontier where the land stretched so wide a person could disappear into it, or, if they were lucky, find themselves. The annual Cimarron Flats race day drew riders from as far north as Colorado and as far south as the Texas border, and for the past 4 years running, there had been one name on every tongue before the starting pistol even fired: Tobias Hale. 28 years old, lean as a whip and twice as sharp, with sun-darkened skin, dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, and hands that seemed to speak a private language to every horse he touched. He had won the Cimarron race 3 years in a row. He had won the Santa Fe circuit twice. He had taken first place at the Pueblo Invitational, the Raton Pass Derby, and a half-dozen smaller contests scattered across the territories like seeds. People said Tobias Hale could make a horse do things horses did not naturally want to do, not by cruelty, but by some deep, wordless understanding between man and animal that bordered on something spiritual. He had ridden into Cimarron that morning on his gray stallion, Sovereign, and the crowd had parted for him the way crowds always parted for Tobias Hale, with a kind of admiring deference that he wore as naturally as his battered leather hat. He had not noticed the woman at the registration table until she was already signing her name. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned loosely beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, brown eyes that caught the light with an alertness that suggested she missed very little, and a quality about her bearing that was neither soft nor hard but something more precise than either. She wore a plain cotton blouse tucked into riding trousers, which alone was enough to draw whispers in 1878, and her boots were scuffed in a way that spoke of actual work rather than decoration. Beside her at the hitching post stood a bay mare named Calliope, a horse of no particular fame or breeding note, whose coat was a deep reddish brown and whose eyes held a calm intelligence that Tobias noticed even from a distance, because Tobias Hale always noticed horses before he noticed people. The race itself was 1.25 miles along the creek road, looping through a stand of cottonwoods and coming back hard up the main track into town. 14 riders entered. Most of them were known quantities. A few were hopefuls from outlying ranches. And one was Beatrice Grady, who had ridden into Cimarron the previous day from a small homestead 40 miles east, who had paid her entry fee from a carefully folded sum of money she kept in her coat pocket, and who had told no one her intentions beyond herself and her horse. When the pistol cracked and the horses lunged forward, Tobias had taken the inside line as he always did, Sovereign surging into the lead with that magnificent, ground-eating stride that had made him a legend. The crowd roared. Dust rose in a thick curtain. For the first 1/4 mile, it was exactly the race everyone expected, and then Beatrice Grady moved. She had held Calliope back just enough in the opening surge to find clean air on the outside, and now she let the mare run the way the mare had been bred to run, which was fast and economical, and with a kind of joyful purpose that seemed to say, "This is what I am for." Calliope's strides were shorter than Sovereign's but faster in turnover, and through the cottonwood bend where the track curved sharply left, Beatrice sat the turn with a precision that ate up ground without wasting a single movement. By the time they came out of the trees and hit the straight run back into town, she was level with Tobias. He looked over. She did not look back. She was looking at the finish line the way a hawk looks at the ground, with complete and total focus, and Calliope responded to whatever quiet communication passed between them with a final, brilliant surge that carried them across the finish, 3 lengths clear. The silence that followed was not the silence of disappointment, but the silence of genuine astonishment, the kind that precedes an explosion of noise rather than following one, and when the explosion came, it was considerable. Tobias Hale brought Sovereign back to a canter, then a trot, then a walk, and he rode to where the woman in the battered hat was already dismounting beside her bay mare, stroking the horse's neck with both hands and murmuring something close to the animal's ear with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love. He pulled Cimarron up beside her. He looked at the finishing post. He looked at his horse. He looked at her. The dust was still drifting through the golden afternoon light like something ceremonial when he leaned slightly forward in the saddle and said, "I'd like to know your name before this dust settles, if you're willing to tell it." She turned then and looked at him directly, and there was nothing flirtatious or performative in the way she did it. She simply looked at him the way she had looked at the finish line, with complete and total attention. "Beatrice Grady," she said, "and that is the finest horse you have got, so do not be too hard on yourself." He blinked. He had expected many things from this moment, having spent approximately 20 seconds recovering from the shock of losing a race for the first time in 3 years, but he had not expected to be comforted. "Tobias Hale," he said. "I know who you are," Beatrice said. "Everybody knows who you are." "They do," he agreed, without particular vanity. "They just don't usually beat me." "Calliope beat you," she said, which was not quite a correction but not quite agreement either, and she turned back to her horse with the matter apparently settled in her own mind. Tobias sat there for a moment longer than was strictly dignified, Cimarron shifting beneath him with the restless energy of a horse that had run hard and wanted acknowledgement of the fact. Around them the crowd was reforming, people pressing forward with congratulations and questions, and the particular noise of a fairground recovering from surprise. Someone was already thrusting prize money at Beatrice, $25, which was enough to mean something real in 1878. She accepted it with a brief nod of thanks and tucked it carefully into her coat pocket beside what remained of her entry fee. "Where are you riding from?" Tobias asked, because he found he was not ready to stop talking to her, which was unusual for him. He was not an unfriendly man, but he was a solitary one, more comfortable with horses than with most people, and small talk had never come naturally to him. She glanced back at him. "East of here. I have a homestead claim on the Cimarron River, about 40 miles out. That's a long ride for one day's racing. It's a long ride back too," she said, "which is why I intend to win the pot so the 2 days are worth the road time." She nodded toward the announcement board where the schedule of afternoon events was posted. There was a second race that afternoon, an open invitational with a larger purse. "I assume you are entering again." "I have not missed the afternoon race in 4 years, Tobias said. "Then I will see you at the starting line," she said, and led Calliope toward the water troughs with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how the afternoon was going to go. Tobias watched her go for a moment, then turned Cimarron away, and as he rode toward the livery to let the stallion rest and drink, he was aware of something he did not immediately have words for, a kind of alertness in his chest, as if something that had been closed for a long time had opened a crack and was letting in light. He won the afternoon race by half a length, because Calliope had run brilliantly in the morning and was not quite at her best in the heat of the later afternoon, and because Tobias rode Cimarron with a focused desperation that was entirely new to him. He crossed the finish line, and his first instinct, before anything else, was to turn and look for the bay mare and her rider, who came in second with a grace that suggested second place was a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. The fairground social that evening was held in the big barn at the south end of town, with fiddle music and plank tables loaded with food that people had brought from across the county, and lanterns hanging from the rafters casting everything in warm yellow light. Tobias arrived alone, as he usually did, and found himself a cup of cider and a spot near the barn wall from which he could watch the room, as was his habit. He found her within 30 seconds. She was standing with the woman who ran the dry goods store, a large, warm-voiced woman named Ada Perkins, apparently engaged in a discussion about the relative merits of different flour strains for bread baking, which seemed to Tobias like a remarkably practical conversation, for a woman who had spent the day shocking an entire county's collective understanding of racing to its foundations. He did not immediately cross the room. He was not sure what he intended to say, and he had learned with horses and apparently now with people that you did not rush at things you cared about. You waited. You read the situation. You approached when the moment was right. The moment turned out to be when Ada Perkins was claimed by her husband for a dance and Beatrice Grady was left standing alone near the east wall with her cup of cider and her own quiet observation of the room, her eyes moving over the crowd with that same alert intelligence he had noticed at the starting line. "You're doing it again," he said, coming to stand beside her. She looked at him. "Doing what?" "Looking at everything like you're calculating odds." A pause. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "I suppose I am. Comes from being on your own a lot. You learn to read situations before you're inside them." "The homestead," he said. "You manage it alone." "I do." She said it without particular pride or apology, simply as a fact. "My father passed 2 years ago. He filed the claim before he died. I filed the improvements and proved it up. It is mine now." "That is not an easy thing," he said, and he meant it simply, without condescension. He had seen homestead life up close. He knew what it cost. "No," she agreed. "It is not." She looked at him sideways. "You are the first person today who has said that without sounding like they believe I ought to have done something else instead." "What do they think you should have done instead?" "Sold it. Gone to live with a cousin in Santa Fe. Married someone." She paused. "Though usually not in that particular order." He laughed, which surprised him and apparently surprised her too, because she turned to look at him more fully. "You have a good laugh," she said straightforwardly. "I would not have guessed it from your reputation." "What is my reputation for?" "Being serious," she said. "Being very, very good at one thing and not much interested in anything else." "Horses," he said. "Horses," she agreed. "That is fairly accurate." He turned his cup in his hands. The fiddle music filled the warm barn air. Someone called for a reel, and couples began moving toward the cleared space in the center. "Though I find myself interested in other things occasionally." She looked at him steadily. She was not a woman who looked away from directness. He was already beginning to understand that about her. "Occasionally," she said. "What brings you 40 miles to race?" he asked, because he genuinely wanted to know and because he suspected the answer was more layered than the prize money. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "My father used to race. He was not as good as people said, but he loved it completely. He raised calliope from a foal. He told me she was going to be something special, and I did not quite believe him until about a year after he died, when I was training her in the creek bottom and she just opened up one morning and I thought he was right." She paused. "He never got to see it, so I came." Tobias was quiet with that for a moment. He understood it in the way that people understand things that resonate against something already in them. "My father taught me to ride," he said. "He died when I was 19. I won my first real race a month after the funeral. I kept thinking he was going to be in the crowd." She nodded, not with sympathy exactly, but with recognition. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." They stood there together for a while longer than was probably necessary, the crowd moving around them, the fiddle music rising and falling, and Tobias was aware that this was the longest conversation he had willingly sustained with another person in a considerable amount of time that did not involve the care or discussion of horses, and even more aware that it did not feel long at all. It felt like something beginning rather than something to be endured. "Would you dance?" he asked, which was not something he usually asked. She looked at the dance floor, then at him. "I am not very accomplished at it." "Neither am I. We could be unaccomplished together." Another almost smile. "That does sound less terrible than the alternative," she said, and set down her cup. And when he offered his hand, she took it without hesitation, which he suspected was simply who she was, a woman who did not waste time on false uncertainty about things she had already decided. They danced badly and cheerfully through a reel, and then something slower that the fiddler called a waltz, though it bore only a partial resemblance to that form. And by the end of it Tobias Hale, who had ridden alone and slept in bunkhouses and kept most of his own company for the better part of a decade, found himself standing in a lantern-lit barn in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1878, not wanting the evening to end. He walked her to the livery where she had stabled Calliope for the night, because she had decided to ride back in the morning rather than in the dark, and they stood in the open livery door while Sovereign and Calliope regarded each other with the tolerant interest of horses who have already sized each other up. "How long does your claim run?" he asked. 5 years, she said. "I have 3 more to complete the improvement requirements." "What kind of land?" "Good land if you work it. Creek access, decent grass. I have 12 cattle and a kitchen garden and enough to see the winter through if I am careful." She paused. "It is small, but it is mine. There is a great deal in that, I think." "There is," he agreed. He leaned against the door frame. "I have a place north of Springer. I took over management of the Altman Ranch about 2 years ago. Theodore Altman is getting on in years and his son went east and did not come back, so he put me on as foreman with a share agreement." "A share in the ranch?" She looked at him with interest. "In the horses, primarily. I breed them, sell them. I still race when it suits me, but the breeding is where I am trying to build something lasting." He paused. "Sovereign is the best of my stallion line. I have 4 mares I am very hopeful about." "Calliope is a mare I would be proud to breed from," she said thoughtfully, and then glanced at him sideways again with that almost smile. "That is not a suggestion, I am simply noting it." "I noticed that too," he said. "She has remarkable stride efficiency. Her conformation is better than you'd know from a distance. My father bred her out of a half-thoroughbred mare and a quarter-horse stallion that belonged to a rancher in Mora. That explains the speed-to-endurance balance." He was genuinely fascinated now, falling into the easy fluency that horses always unlocked in him. "The thoroughbred gives you the pace, but the quarter horse gives you the shorter burst capacity and the ground sense. In the turns, she was extraordinary." "She trusts me completely," Beatrice said simply. "That is the thing. We have been through enough together that she knows I am not going to ask her for anything she cannot give." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is exactly it," he said. "That is the whole of it right there." She looked back at him, and there was something between them in the warm summer night air of that livery doorway, something neither of them named because they were both careful people who did not name things prematurely, but it was there, substantial and warm and unmistakable. "I should sleep," she said. "I have a long road in the morning." "I hope Calliope comes to Cimarron again next year," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Is that the only thing you are hoping, Tobias Hale?" He held her gaze. "No," he said honestly, "it is not." She nodded, as if this was the correct answer to a question she had been quietly holding, and then she said good night with the same directness she applied to everything and went to check on her horse, and Tobias walked back through the Cimarron night to the room he had let at the boarding house, and lay on his back on the narrow bed, and looked at the ceiling and thought about bay mares and the women who understood them. He did not sleep for quite some time. The next morning she was gone before he woke, which he had half expected and half feared, and he found himself riding north toward Springer in the September heat with a peculiar restlessness that sat behind his sternum like a low-burning coal, reminding him it was there every time he forgot about it for a few minutes. He thought about it practically and practically. It was a problem with a straightforward solution, which was simply to ride east from Springer to the Cimarron River and see if the homestead of Beatrice Grady was where she had said it was. 40 miles was not a long ride for a man who had ridden a great deal longer for a great deal less. He waited 2 weeks because he was not a man who acted on impulse without first examining the impulse to determine whether it was sound. And after 2 weeks of finding his thoughts returning to a pair of direct brown eyes and a horse that ran like joy personified, he had determined that the impulse was sound. He told Theodore Altman he was riding east for a few days on personal business. Theodore, who was 73 years old and had watched Tobias manage his horses with a devoted focus that left no time for anything resembling a personal life, raised both white eyebrows and said, "A woman, is it?" Tobias said he did not know yet. Theodore said, "Well, find out," and that was the end of that conversation. He rode east on Cimarron along the Cimarron River Road in the early morning, with the cottonwoods beginning to go gold at the edges, and found the Grady homestead in the afternoon by asking at a small trading post 12 miles east of town, where a weathered man named Pete Holloway told him to follow the creek 3 miles until he saw a stand of 3 cottonwoods close together, and then turn south for a 1/4 mile and he would see the roof. He saw the roof. It was a small house, solidly built, with a barn beside it that was slightly larger than the house itself in the way of working homesteads where the livestock took precedence. There was a kitchen garden to the east side that was still producing late-season vegetables, and a corral behind the barn where Calliope stood in the afternoon shade with the calm, well-fed look of a horse who was loved and well-kept. Beatrice was in the corral itself, working with a young heifer that had evidently decided it did not want to cooperate with whatever she had in mind. She had not heard him approach over the sound of the heifer's considerable complaints, and he sat sovereign at the fence and watched her for a moment with the quiet appreciation of someone watching a skilled person do difficult work. She was patient. She was very, very patient. She moved with the heifer rather than against it, giving ground when the animal resisted and taking it back quietly when the animal settled, until the heifer was standing still, and Beatrice was doing something to its rear leg that required her to crouch and hold simultaneously, which was not a dignified position, but she maintained it with complete composure. "Thorn," she said without looking up, and he realized she had been aware of him for some time. "In the fetlock. I have been at this for 20 minutes. Do you need another hand?" he asked. "I need this heifer to hold still for 10 more seconds," she said. And then the heifer lurched sideways and Beatrice went with it in a controlled stumble that kept her from going down entirely. And when she straightened up there was a long thorn held between her fingers and a look of mild triumph on her face that he found unreasonably compelling. She let the heifer go, watched it trot to the far corner of the corral with an air of deeply injured dignity, and then she turned and looked at him over the fence. She was dusty, and there was a grass stain on her knee and her hair had mostly escaped its pins. She looked exactly the way a woman running a homestead alone looked after a working afternoon, and Tobias Hale, who had been to socials and had seen women in their best circumstances, found that this was considerably more interesting. "You rode 40 miles, she said. "You rode 40 miles first," he pointed out. She considered this logic. "I came for the race." "I came for you," he said, and then was slightly startled by his own directness, but he had examined the impulse and found it sound, and he was not a man who, having found a thing sound, then retreated from it. She was quiet for a moment. She set the thorn down on the fence post. She looked at him with that complete, unhurried attention. "You had better put your horse in the barn," she said. "I am going to make coffee." He put his horse in the barn. He was careful about it, which she noticed from the kitchen window, the way he checked the water and the condition of the stall before he left, the way he spoke briefly to Calliope as he passed her, which made the mare lift her head with interest. She noted these things the way she noted most things, quietly and thoroughly. They sat on the porch in the long September afternoon light and drank coffee from tin cups, and she told him about the homestead and what it required and what it was becoming, and he talked about the Altman Ranch and his breeding program and his plans for the line he was developing. And between these practical conversations about work and land and horses they were, very precisely, telling each other who they were. He stayed for 3 days. He slept in the barn, which was the only arrangement that was proper, and she fed him from the kitchen garden and the preserved stores, and they worked the homestead together during the days, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked while the Cimarron stars filled up the sky overhead in their millions. On the 3rd evening she said, "You do not have to keep sleeping in the barn." He looked at her. "Beatrice." "I did not mean anything untoward by that," she said, with a precision that suggested she did not waste words on things she did not mean. "I meant that you are clearly a decent man, and this is my home, and I am saying you are welcome in it. There is a second room that was my father's. You can sleep there if you want to stop pretending the barn is comfortable." He moved to the second room, which had a cot and a small window, and still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco from her father, and it was one of the most comfortable places he had slept in years. He rode back to Springer on the fourth morning with Cimarron moving underneath him at a long, easy walk, and he spent the 2-day ride thinking about land and horses and a woman on a porch looking at stars. He came back 3 weeks later, and 3 weeks after that. The rides became regular, and the visits became longer, and by November he was making the ride every 2 weeks with a reliability that Theodore Altman found very satisfying and made no comment on beyond occasionally having extra provisions packed on the spare horse when Tobias set out, which was Theodore's way of saying what he thought without saying it. On his fourth visit, he came in a cold snap that had turned the cottonwood leaves brown and brittle and put ice in the puddles by morning. He arrived to find Beatrice dealing with a broken fence section on the north pasture through which 2 of her cattle had escaped into the creek brush, and he tied Cimarron and helped without being asked, and they spent the better part of an afternoon working cold-stiffened fence wire in the November chill, and she laughed at something he said, which was not the almost smile he had been seeing but a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it landed in his chest like the first warm day after a long winter. In December, he asked her if she would consider coming to the Altman Ranch for Christmas. Theodore had said to invite her, and also that if Tobias did not get a move on with whatever he was doing, he was going to be left behind by time, which was Theodore's way of being helpful. "Theodore Altman," she said thoughtfully, "old man with a white beard and a breeding operation that goes back 30 years. You know of him." My father spoke well of him, said he treated his animals and his people fairly. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "That is not a small thing." "He is a good man," Tobias said, "the best I have worked for." She looked at the fire in the hearth, thinking. The homestead was weathered in for winter, and she had done everything that could be done to prepare it. She had neighbors who could check in on the cattle. Calliope traveled with her wherever she went, and it was 40 miles of road through December cold, which was not nothing. "Yes," she said, "I will come." The Christmas at the Altman Ranch was a warm, crowded affair, because Theodore Altman had more friends and former employees and various relatives by marriage than seemed possible for one old man, and the ranch house filled up with people and cooking smells and the sound of children running on wood floors. Beatrice moved through it with the same careful attentiveness she brought to everything, and Tobias watched her and saw her being easy with people, genuinely easy, laughing with Theodore about his horses, and talking quietly with Theodore's niece about garden soil, and it was precisely as he had suspected, that she was not reserved by nature but by circumstance, that she had simply not had a great deal of occasion to be around people who deserved her openness. Theodore pulled Tobias aside after dinner on Christmas Eve and said, "Fine woman," in the way that closed a subject rather than opened one. "Yes," Tobias said, "you have a plan. I am working on one." Theodore made a sound that managed to convey both approval and the mild suggestion that working on a plan and executing a plan were different things. He went back to his chair by the fire and his tobacco pipe, and Tobias stood in the hallway of the ranch house and listened to Beatrice in the kitchen helping with the washing up, laughing at something Theodore's niece had said, and thought that he needed to stop working on a plan and simply proceed. He did not manage it at Christmas itself, because the moment never quite arranged itself the way he felt it should, and then January arrived with its cold seriousness, and Beatrice rode back to her homestead because the cattle needed her and the homestead needed her, and he rode with her to see her safe home, and then turned Cimarron north again into the wind. It was February, on one of his regular visits, that the trouble began. He had noticed, on the last 2 visits, that the land east of the Grady homestead, a stretch of good creek bottom grazing that belonged to a rancher named Dawson Carr, had been getting more activity than usual. Carr was not a man Tobias knew well but knew of. in the way that you knew men in the territories by reputation before you knew them in person. The reputation was not warm. Carr ran a large cattle operation and had a habit of expanding it by pressuring smaller landholders to sell at prices well below value, which was not uncommon in 1878, but was not therefore less unjust for being common. Beatrice had mentioned, briefly and without particular alarm, that Carr's foreman had come by twice in January to ask if she had considered selling. "What did you tell him?" Tobias asked. "I told him I had not and did not intend to," she said. "And he accepted that." She paused just slightly before answering. "He was not rude," she said. "He was very polite, which was, honestly, more uncomfortable." Tobias recognized what she was describing. The politeness of men who believe the first ask is a courtesy before the real conversation begins. In March, one of Beatrice's cattle was found at the far edge of the property with a cut that was not a natural injury. In April, a section of fence she had repaired twice was cut clean through at the post. These were things that could have explanations, and she was not a woman who moved to conclusions without evidence, but she was also not a woman who failed to notice patterns. When Carr's foreman came a third time in April with another offer, now higher than before, she told him directly that the homestead was not for sale at any price, and asked him to communicate that clearly to his employer. The foreman tipped his hat and rode away, and she watched him go, and felt the particular cold certainty of a person who knows that the refusal of a polite conversation is the beginning of a less polite one. She wrote to Tobias, because she was not too proud to name a concern to someone she trusted, and because she had come over the winter to understand that Tobias Hale was precisely the kind of man she trusted. He was at her homestead inside of 3 days, having ridden through 2 of them and slept 3 hours at a trading post in between. He arrived in the blue early morning and she met him at the barn door, already awake because she rarely slept past the dawn, and they stood in the cold morning together while he read the situation in her face. "Tell me everything," he said. She told him everything steadily and completely without dramatizing it or minimizing it. The cattle, the fence, the visits. The careful pattern of pressure that had the rhythm of something orchestrated rather than accidental. "I am not frightened," she said. "I want to make that clear. But I am concerned in a way that seems worth being practical about." "Yes," he said, "it does." He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about most things. Direct confrontation with Carr was available to him, but was unlikely to resolve the root problem and might escalate it. The territorial law in 1878 was present but stretched thin across distances that made response unreliable. The best approach, he concluded, was documentation, visibility, and allies. "You need witnesses to the pattern," he said, "written records with dates. If Carr is going to push further, he will have to account for it publicly." "I have kept records," she said. "I began writing things down when the second fence section was cut." He looked at her with that quality of appreciation that had nothing to do with surprise. "Of course you did," he said. They rode to the county seat at Cimarron together and filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office, citing the documented incidents and requesting that the homestead claim be noted as actively contested by a neighboring party. The Land Office clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers named Mr. Fenn, took the complaint seriously, which was more than they had entirely expected, and told them it would be forwarded to the territorial marshal. The territorial marshal, a large-shouldered man named Elias Cord who had been running his office out of Cimarron for 7 years, received the complaint and paid Dawson Carr a visit within the week. What exactly passed between them was not fully reported, but Carr's foreman did not return to the Grady homestead, and the fence remained intact through the spring. Whether this was resolution or simply a pause was a question that remained open, but the immediate pressure had eased. On the ride back from Cimarron, with the spring grass coming in green along the creek road and the cottonwoods putting out their new leaves in that particular brilliant green that only existed for about 2 weeks in April before it deepened and settled, Beatrice said, "Thank you. You had already done everything necessary, he said. The records, the direct refusal. I mostly just rode with you. You rode fast, she said. I always ride fast when it matters, he said, which was true on multiple levels and both of them knew it. They rode in comfortable silence for a while and then she said, You have been riding back and forth for 7 months. 8 months, he said. Looked at him sideways. You are very precise about that. I count things I care about. A pause. The horses walked easily together in the spring morning, Sovereign's gray flank and Calliope's bay coat moving in and out of the cottonwood shade. It was the most beautiful morning Tobias had seen in a considerable time, or possibly it was an ordinary morning and he was simply paying more attention. What are you counting toward? She asked. He reined Sovereign to a gentle stop. She stopped Calliope beside him. They were in the shade of a big cottonwood beside the creek, and the water ran shallow and clear over round stones, and a meadowlark was singing somewhere close, and he thought that if he was going to say this, he was going to say it now, in this exact place, because he was not a man who put off things he had examined thoroughly and found sound. Beatrice, he said, I would very much like to ask you to marry me, if that is something you would consider. She looked at him for a long moment, completely still, and he had learned to read her silences, and this one did not feel like hesitation, but like the same deliberateness she brought to everything important. I would consider it very seriously, she said, but I need to ask you something first. Ask it. This homestead, she said, this is mine, my father's work and my work in Calliope's first home, and the place I intend to be for the next 30 years at minimum. I am not going to sell it or leave it. Not for Dawson Carr and not for anyone else. If you are asking me to marry you, you are also asking me if I want to share what I am building here. I need to know whether that is something you actually want, and not something you are prepared to manage around. He had thought about this. He had thought about it carefully on many of those 40-mile rides, and he had been honest with himself because he was always honest with himself about things that mattered. I talked to Theodore in February, he said. He is planning to deed the horse operation to me over the next 2 years. He has no one else to leave it to, and I have been building it as much as he has for the past 4 years. But the Altman Ranch land itself is going to his niece's family, which is right. There is no house there that would be mine to bring you to. He paused. I have been thinking that a man with a horse breeding operation needs land with water access and good grazing, and 40-mile rides in winter are not something I can sustain indefinitely with the kind of commitment the horses require. What I have been thinking is that if your homestead became our homestead, with proper investment and development, it is a better foundation than anything I could build from scratch. If you are willing to share it, I would be coming to you, and that is exactly what I want. She was very still. You thought about this, she said. For months, he said. I would not come to you with something I had not thought about. The horse operation, she said. You would bring it here. I have been looking at your land carefully. The creek access is excellent. The north pasture would need expansion, but the land adjacent is open territory claim that could be filed. We could build a proper breeding facility within 2 years if we worked it together. You have been planning, she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm and deep and not quite concealed. I plan things I care about, he said. She looked at the creek. She looked at the meadowlark that had just landed on a branch above them, regarding them both with bright black eyes. She looked at Tobias. Yes, she said. Yes, Tobias Hale, I will marry you. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, which she gave him without hesitation, and they sat there together for a moment in the April morning, while the creek ran over its stones and the meadowlark sang, and it was the simplest and most complete thing either of them had felt in a very long time. They were married in June in Cimarron, because it was the nearest town with a church and a minister who could perform the ceremony, and because it was the town where the story had started, which seemed right. Theodore Altman came and sat in the front pew with the careful dignity of a very old man attending something he has been hoping for. And Ada Perkins from the dry goods store came, because she had liked Beatrice Grady from the moment she met her at the fairground social, and had quietly been pulling for this outcome since November. Marshal Elia's cord came because Tobias had ridden in his circuit long enough to be considered a friend, and Pete Holloway from the trading post came because word travels and Pete liked any occasion that involved a celebration. Beatrice wore a dress of blue cotton that she and Ada had worked on together over the preceding 2 months, not elaborate by the standards of 1878 fashion elsewhere, but beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are made with care and fit the person wearing them exactly. She carried 2 stems of late June wildflowers from the creek bank, because she was not a woman who valued ceremony for its own sake, but understood that moments needed marking. Tobias stood at the front of the little church in his good black coat, which he had brushed very thoroughly, and when she walked down the narrow aisle toward him, he thought that he was the luckiest man in 3 territories, which was a considerable revision from how he had felt about the race at Cimarron the previous September, when he had been the finest horseman in 3 territories. And now he thought that being the finest horseman in 3 territories was honestly not the most important thing that had happened to him in the past year by a considerable margin. The minister spoke the words. They said what needed to be said. Theodore produced a ring from his coat pocket at the necessary moment, which was his own late wife's, and which he had offered at Christmas with the air of a man who had been holding it ready. And Tobias put it on Beatrice's hand, and she looked at it, and then looked at him with an expression that was not an almost smile but a full one, open and unguarded, and for him alone. After the ceremony, in the same barn where they had danced badly together the previous September, there was a celebration that involved better fiddle music than the original, considerable amounts of food, and a great deal of noise, and Tobias danced with his wife, and she was still not accomplished at it, and neither was he, and it was still better than anything he could imagine. They rode back to the homestead together in the blue summer evening, Sovereign and Calliope side by side on the Cimarron road, the land lying open and golden around them, and Beatrice said, "It is a long road back." "It used to be," Tobias said. "It is not any more." She reached across and put her hand over his on the reins, briefly, and then they rode home. The summer and fall of 1879 were the fullest working time either of them had known. They filed the adjacent land claim in July, bringing an additional 120 acres into the homestead, and the new land had a natural hollow that was perfect for a horse barn with good wind shelter. Theodore released the first 4 mares of Tobias's breeding line in August, driving them east himself in a small wagon despite being 74 years old, insisting that he was perfectly capable of a 2-day wagon journey, and that Tobias could stop looking at him with that expression. The mares settled quickly, because the pasture was good, and Calliope received them with the easy authority of a horse who had been on this land long enough to know its rhythms, and Sovereign occupied the new stallion paddock with magnificent satisfaction. Tobias built the breeding records with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, documenting bloodlines and conformation and temperament in the leather-bound ledger he kept in the house, and Beatrice added her own observations in the margins in her precise, clear handwriting, because she watched the horses with an eye that was already expert and getting more so. They worked side by side every day, and it was not always easy because good work rarely is, and the frontier in 1878 and 1879 did not accommodate softness, but it was always honest. They argued occasionally, because they were both people with opinions and the kind of deep certainty in their own judgment that comes from spending a great deal of time relying on it, and they learned that arguments between them tended to resolve quickly, because neither of them was interested in winning for its own sake, only in getting to the right answer. Dawson Carr made no further trouble. The territorial marshal's visit had apparently communicated something definitive, and the spring of 1879 brought word through the county networks that Carr was having difficulties of his own, related to a grazing dispute on his eastern boundary, and that his attention had redirected. Beatrice filed it under resolved but not forgotten, which was her approach to most things that carried a lesson. In October, she told Tobias she was expecting a child. They were in the kitchen in the morning, and she said it with the same directness she said everything, holding her coffee cup and looking at him with that alert steadiness that was the way she faced everything, and he sat down quite suddenly because his legs made that decision for him. "Yes," she said, "that is approximately how I received the information as well." He looked at her. He looked at the window where the October morning was coming in with its gold light. He looked back at her. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am entirely well," she said. "I am, in fact, better than well. I simply thought you should know." He stood up and went around the table, and she stood, and he held her carefully, as if she might have developed a new fragility, and she laughed against his shoulder and said, "I am not made of spun glass, Tobias," and he loosened his hold but did not let go. "March," she said, "approximately." "Then we have time to do what needs doing," he said, which was his way of saying that he was going to think about everything that needed preparing and prepare it, which was also the way he said "I love you" in the particular dialect of a practical and thorough man. "Yes," she said, "we do." Theodore came for Christmas again that year, traveling by wagon because the horse was too much in his own estimation, and he spent 3 days on the homestead eating Beatrice's cooking with an expression of profound satisfaction, and walking the horse operation with Tobias and pronouncing everything either very good or better than he expected, which from Theodore constituted high praise. On his last evening he sat by the fire and looked at the room, at Beatrice sewing near the lamp and Tobias going over the breeding ledger at the table, and he said, "Your father built a good start here," to Beatrice, and she looked up and said, "He did." "We are building on it," and Theodore said, "I can see that," and settled deeper in his chair with his tobacco pipe. He died in February of 1880, peacefully in his own house, at 74 years old, with all of his business settled, and the horse operation formally transferred to Tobias Hale as per the arrangements they had put in order the previous fall. It was a loss that Tobias felt with a quiet depth that he expressed primarily by riding out alone on the first clear morning after the funeral, and staying out for several hours, and coming home with something closed and resolved in his face, the way grief settles when it has been properly attended to. Beatrice let him go and had dinner warm when he came back and did not ask questions, because she understood that some things needed space rather than company. Their son was born on the 15th of March, 1880, in the homestead house with the spring wind coming up the river, and a midwife from Cimarron who had been engaged since January. He was large and healthy and outraged by the world in the way of new people, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes and a quality of alert attention that, once he had settled into the idea that the world existed and was going to continue to exist, expressed itself in a steady gaze that seemed to take in everything around him with remarkable thoroughness. "Samuel," Beatrice said, when Tobias asked, because she had been thinking about names since October. "After my father." "Samuel Hale," Tobias said, testing it. "Samuel Grady Hale," she said, "if that is acceptable." "That is exactly right," he said. He held his son in the lamplight of the homestead bedroom, this man who had been raised in bunkhouses and had spent years sleeping in barns, and had built his entire identity around a wordless communication with horses, and he held this small, fierce, perfect person with the same care and complete attention he gave to everything he loved, and felt something shift in him that he did not have a word for but that reordered everything. The spring of 1880 was the busiest they had known. The first foals from Tobias's breeding program were born, 3 of them, including one gray colt from Sovereign's line that was so obviously exceptional that both Tobias and Beatrice stood at the paddock fence and watched him in silence for a long time before either of them said anything. And what Tobias said was, "That is the next Sovereign," and what Beatrice said was, "He is going to be better than Sovereign," and Tobias considered this and said, "Yes." because it was true, and he had enough confidence in what he had built to say so without bitterness. They named the gray colt Meridian. He grew quickly and moved with the extraordinary economy of a horse that has inherited the best of both his parents' lines. And by the autumn of 1880, he was turning heads among the horsemen who rode through the territory and stopped at the Hale homestead, which was increasingly known as a place where exceptional horses were being bred. Word moved through the territories the way word always moved, slowly but completely. And by 1881 there were buyers coming from as far as Colorado and as far south as the Texas Panhandle to look at Tobias's horses. He was selective about who he sold to, more selective than was purely economically rational, because he took the same view of his horses that Beatrice took of Calliope, which was that you did not send an animal to a situation you did not trust, and Beatrice agreed with this policy completely, and defended it against the occasional buyer who believed that money should settle any question. In September of 1881, on the anniversary of the Cimarron race, Beatrice said at breakfast, "They are running the annual race next week." He looked at her over his coffee. "I know. Meridian is ready," she said. Tobias was quiet for a moment. He had been thinking the same thing for 2 months but had not said it, partly because the breeding operation was the priority and racing was the past, and partly because he was not sure how he felt about putting his best young horse into competition when the horse was still only a year and a half, which was young for serious racing but not unheard of. "He is ready," Tobias agreed, "but it is a question of whether this is the right time." "What is the right time?" she asked. "You think we should enter him?" "I think we should enter both of them," she said. "Meridian in the young horse class, Calliope in the open." He looked at her. She was looking at him with that expression that she had worn the first time he had ever seen her, at the registration table at Cimarron, which was the expression of a woman who has already decided and is simply being courteous enough to include you in the decision. "You are going to race again," he said. "I never stopped wanting to," she said. "I have just been busy." He thought about this. Samuel was 17 months old and could be left with their neighbor, a kind woman named Ruth Calloway, who had homesteaded the adjacent claim, and who adored Samuel with the wholehearted devotion of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own and found she missed it. "Then we are going to Cimarron," he said. The race that September was different and the same. The fairground was the same. The creek road was the same. The cottonwood smell and the dust and the crowd noise were all precisely as they had been 2 years ago. But Beatrice came to the registration table now with her husband beside her and her mare beside him, and the gray colt Meridian on a lead, and she signed her name and Tobias signed his name, and the crowd recognized both of them with the particular warm reception given to people who have become a kind of local legend. Meridian ran in the young horse class, and won it by such a convincing margin that the crowd cheered with the uncomplicated joy of people who have just witnessed something excellent. Calliope ran in the open race, and she ran with all the fluid brilliance she had always possessed, and Beatrice rode her with the same total communication that had won them the race 2 years ago. And they won again, which caused such a response from the crowd that it was some time before the noise settled enough to have a conversation. Tobias came to them at the finish line and stood beside Calliope, and put his hand on Beatrice's knee where her leg rested in the stirrup, and looked up at her with an expression that she had come to know over the past 2 years, and that still did the same thing it always had to something in the center of her chest. "I asked your name before the dust settled," he said. She looked down at him. "You did." "Best thing I ever did," he said. She put her hand over his where it rested on her knee. Behind them, Meridian was dancing on his lead with the uncomplicated excitement of a young horse who has just run a great race and knows it, and Sovereign was watching from the paddock with the composed satisfaction of a patriarch, and the Cimarron crowd was still celebrating, and the late September sun was warm on the backs of their hands. The years that followed were good years. The horse operation grew steadily, not explosively but with the solid, deliberate growth of something built on quality rather than haste. By 1883, Hale horses were known across 3 territories and into Colorado, sought for their combination of speed and endurance, and the quality of mind that Tobias cultivated in his breeding selection with the same care a musician brings to composing, attention to the whole as well as the parts. Meridian became exactly what both of them had known he would be, a horse of exceptional quality, who won races across the territory for 3 years running, and then retired to breeding with the kind of accumulated reputation that made his progeny valuable before they had proven themselves individually. Tobias was proud of Meridian in the way he was proud of everything he built, with a quiet satisfaction that did not need external affirmation, but was genuinely pleased by it when it arrived. Calliope, at 12 years old, was no longer a racing horse, but was the heart of the Hale homestead in a way that had nothing to do with races, a presence of calm authority in the paddock, a mare that younger horses seemed to orient around, and Beatrice's companion in the way that certain animals become indispensable to certain people, not as property, but as something more layered and mutual than that. Beatrice herself had become known in the county for 2 things beyond her racing victories. One was her horses, naturally, and her eye for horseflesh and her management of the breeding records, which she had taken on as fully as Tobias, and which were widely considered the most thorough in the territory. The other was her willingness to speak plainly at the quarterly county meetings about the land pressures that continued to affect smaller homesteaders across the Cimarron River Valley. The injustice that Dawson Carr had attempted on her homestead had not been unique to her, and she had watched it happen to neighbors who had less documentation and less support than she had possessed, and she had decided that watching was not sufficient. She was not a political person in any formal sense, because politics in 1880s New Mexico territory was complicated and often dirty, and she was not interested in dirty politics. But she had a clarity of expression and a precision of argument that made her effective at county meetings in a way that impressed even the people who disagreed with her. And over several years, she became a consistent voice for enforcing the land protection laws that existed but were inconsistently applied. She won some of these arguments and lost others, but the homesteaders around Cimarron knew that Beatrice Grady Hale would show up to the meeting and say the clear thing plainly, which mattered even when the outcome was not immediate. In the spring of 1884, their daughter was born. They named her Clara because it was a name that meant clear and bright, and that suited the child from her first day, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's directness, and a laugh that could be heard across the homestead from the time she was old enough to produce one. Samuel was 4 years old and initially assessed his sister with the judicial seriousness of a child who has been the only child for some time and is not immediately certain this development is an improvement. He came around within approximately 2 weeks, not because anyone persuaded him, but because Clara, at roughly 10 days old, grabbed his finger with a grip that he did not expect from something that small and looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and he reported to his mother that she was probably going to be acceptable. Tobias watched his son stand at the edge of the paddock one morning in the spring of 1885, a 5-year-old with his mother's dark hair and his father's careful way of reading a horse before approaching it, and told him the names of every horse in the paddock and what was notable about each of them. Samuel repeated them all back precisely, which was either a very good memory or a demonstration that he had already been paying more attention than anyone had noticed. Tobias suspected the latter because Samuel was his mother's son. Beatrice watched this from the kitchen doorway and felt something so full it was almost difficult to contain, which was happiness, the particular happiness of a life that is working the way you hoped it would work, which is not something to be taken lightly. She thought about her father on these occasions, about the way he had raised Calliope from a foal and told her she was going to be something special, about the fact that he had not lived to see it. She thought about the September morning when she had ridden 40 miles to a fairground and won a race, and a man had asked her name before the dust settled. And she thought about how the distance from that morning to this one was full of everything that made a life. The work, and the cold winters, and the arguments, and the grief, and the building of something real from the ground up. And she thought that her father would have found it very satisfactory. She went out to the paddock and stood beside her husband and her son, and Tobias put his arm around her without looking away from the horses, the way he always did, the way that said she was part of the thing he was looking at and not a separate thing. And she leaned into him and watched Samuel explain to his small sister, who had just toddled out of the barn and was standing with the wide-eyed concentration of a 2-year-old confronting a large animal for approximately the third time, that the gray mare in the corner was named Cassidy and was very gentle, and there was nothing to be frightened of. Clara looked at the gray mare. She looked at her brother. She looked at the mare again. Then she walked right up to the fence and put her small hand through the rail toward the horse with complete and fearless certainty, and Cassidy came over and snuffled at the child's fingers with the mild interest of a well-mannered horse, and Clara said something in the private language of 2-year-olds that seemed to satisfy her completely and turned around and walked back toward the house. "She is not afraid of anything," Tobias said. "Good," Beatrice said. "She should not be." He looked down at her. "Neither should you have been, and you never were." "I was afraid sometimes," she said honestly. "I was afraid when the fence was cut the second time and I was not sure what was coming next. I was afraid the first winter alone when the temperature dropped and I was not certain I had prepared enough." She paused. "I just did not let the fear make my decisions for me." "That is what courage is," he said. "That is what being practical is," she said, which was her version of the same thing. In 1886, Meridian's first full crop went to buyers across the territory and as far as a ranch in Colorado, and the prices they commanded were enough that Tobias sat down with the breeding ledger afterward and looked at the numbers and said, quietly, "Beatrice." "I see it," she said, because she had been keeping the same records. "We can build the north barn," he said. "We can build the north barn and the additional paddocks and still have reserves for a bad season," she said. "Your father picked good land," he said. "He did," she said. "He was a man who knew what he was looking at." They built the north barn that fall, with the help of neighbors and a hired crew from Cimarron, and the raising was a community occasion that involved everyone who lived within 20 miles bringing food and hands and opinions, and the sound of hammers and the smell of new lumber filled the homestead for a week. When it was done, it was the finest horse barn in the county, which was saying something, and Marshall Cord, now retired but still sharp and present at most county events, walked through it and pronounced it first-rate, which it was. The summer of 1887 brought a drought that tested everyone along the Cimarron Valley. The grass went thin in July, and the creek dropped to half its normal flow by August. And it was a summer of hard decisions about cattle numbers and careful water management, and the particular anxiety of watching the sky for rain that does not come. Tobias and Beatrice worked through it with the same methodical focus they brought to everything, reducing their cattle herd to what the land could reliably support, drilling a well to supplement the creek water, and making the breeding program their priority over any expansion plans, because horses they knew and horses they could feed and water efficiently. Their neighbors did not all manage as well. The Calloway family, Ruth and her husband Daniel, had expanded their cattle operation in 1886 based on the previous year's good grass, and the drought hit them significantly. Tobias and Beatrice helped where they could, sharing water access from the new well, and buying a portion of the Calloway cattle at a fair price to reduce the herd pressure, which was simply what neighbors did, though they did it with a generosity that Ruth Calloway said she would never forget. By September, the rains came back and the creek recovered, and the grass grew again with the stubborn persistence of things that have been here longer than the people looking at them, and the valley settled back into its usual rhythms with the quiet relief of a collective exhale. In the fall of 1887, Beatrice entered Calliope in the Cimarron race for the last time. The mare was 13 years old, which was not old for a horse in good condition, and Calliope was in exceptional condition because she had never been asked to do more than she could give. But Beatrice knew as a horsewoman that this was a farewell run rather than a competitive one. She did not say this to Tobias. She did not need to, because Tobias looked at the mare and at his wife and understood it completely. They rode to Cimarron together as they always did, with Samuel at 7 years old now old enough to sit his own pony on the road, and Clara at 3 perched in front of her father on Sovereign, with the supreme confidence of a child who has never found anything in the world to be frightened of. The race was run in the clear September light, and Beatrice let Calliope find her own pace, which was still beautiful and fluid, but no longer the explosive thing it had been at 5 or 6. And they ran together down the creek road through the cottonwoods the way they always had, woman and mare in their private conversation, and they finished 4th, which was a result that the crowd received with an affection they had not given to the winning horse. Because everyone who had been following Cimarron racing since 1878 understood what they were watching. Beatrice rode Calliope to the water trough and dismounted and put her face against the mare's neck for a moment, both arms around her, and the mare stood perfectly still and let herself be held. Tobias did not approach for a few minutes. When he did, he came quietly and stood beside them and put his hand on Calliope's neck beside his wife's head and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. The years built up the way good years do, each one adding something to what had come before rather than replacing it. Samuel grew into a boy, and then a young man who had his father's feel for horses, and his mother's precision with words, and an honesty that both of them recognized from themselves. By 1890, he was 12 years old and genuinely useful in the breeding operation, with opinions about the horses that Tobias listened to with the same serious attention he gave to Beatrice's observations, because Samuel's eye was already better than most adults he had encountered. Clara at 6 was a force of nature in the small, focused way of children who have strong opinions and sufficient will to act on them. She had decided at approximately age 4 that she intended to ride, and had communicated this intention with such clarity and consistency that no one had managed to argue otherwise, and she was now on a small gray pony of her own that she rode with the seat of a child born to it, which she essentially had been. Tobias watched her in the paddock sometimes with an expression that was pure wonder, that this small, fierce person had come from the same place as everything else he loved. He had been thinking for some time about a particular thing, and in the spring of 1890, he finally said it aloud. They were on the porch in the evening, which was where they talked about important things because the porch was where the full scope of the homestead was visible. The barn and the paddocks and the north barn and the pastures going down to the creek, and the Cimarron hills in the distance going blue in the evening light. "I want to enter Sovereign's Son in the Santa Fe circuit this year," he said. Sovereign's Son was the best of Meridian's second foal crop, a gray horse of such exceptional quality that naming him had been a subject of considerable debate until Beatrice had said simply, "He is Sovereign's Son," and that had been that. He was 3 years old and had been trained by Tobias with the same meticulous patience he had brought to every horse he had ever made, and he was ready. "You are going to ride him yourself," Beatrice said. "I was thinking you might." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the pastures with the sideways attention of a man who has said something important and is giving the other person room to receive it. "You are the finest horseman in 3 territories," she said. "I was the finest horseman in 3 territories," he said. "You beat me in 1878. You beat me in the afternoon." "It was close," he said. "Tobias." "Beatrice," he said. "He runs in a way that reminds me of Calliope. He has that same efficiency, that same intelligence in the turn. I think you are the right rider for him." She was quiet for a while. Below them in the evening paddock, Sovereign's son moved along the fence line with the fluid, unhurried grace of a horse who had never been asked to do anything he did not understand, and the light caught his gray coat in a way that made him look like something out of a story. "I will ride him in the training sessions first," she said. "I want to hear what he has to say." "That is exactly right," Tobias said. She rode Sovereign's son through May and June, and what he had to say was extraordinary. He had Sovereign's power and Meridian's speed and something else, a quality of attention that made him seem to anticipate rather than respond, as if the ground between him and the rider was not a distance but a conversation already in progress. Beatrice and the horse reached their understanding inside of 3 weeks, and Tobias watched them work, and knew he had been right. The Santa Fe Circuit in October of 1890 was the largest gathering of quality horses Tobias had seen in a decade of racing. The circuit drew riders from Colorado, from the Texas Panhandle, from across New Mexico territory, and the field was deep with animals of genuine excellence. Beatrice entered in the open invitational and Tobias entered as her handler, which was a role he occupied with complete comfort, because it was not a lesser thing to be the person who had bred and trained the horse being ridden, and he knew this. They walked the track the morning before the race, and he told her everything he had observed about the surface and the camber of the turns, and where the sightlines were tricky, and she listened with the focused attention she always brought, asking the right questions in the right places. That evening they sat in the boarding house they had taken in Santa Fe, and she went over her race plan, and he suggested 2 adjustments, and she accepted one and argued convincingly against the other, and he conceded because she was right. Sovereign's son ran the following afternoon in a field of 22 horses, and he ran the way Tobias had known he would run and Beatrice had come to expect from him, with that extraordinary quality of attention and efficiency, and he won the Santa Fe Invitational by 2 lengths in a time that people discussed for weeks afterward. When Beatrice brought him back to the finish line through the press of the crowd, Tobias was standing exactly where she could find him, because he always positioned himself where she could find him, and she brought the horse to him and he took the reins and she swung down and looked at him and they were both laughing, which was different from their usual composure but was entirely right for the moment. "He is magnificent," she said. "He is," Tobias agreed. "And so are you." She looked at him with that complete attention that had not changed in 12 years of looking. "We built this," she said, "together." "We did," he said. "Starting with a race in Cimarron," she said. "Starting with a race in Cimarron," he agreed. "And a man asking a woman's name before the dust settled." She put her hand on his arm. Around them, Santa Fe in October was brilliant and noisy and full of people, and the particular energy of a city that is not yet entirely settled into what it is going to become, which was true of most places in the territory in 1890, still finding their shape. But Tobias Hale and Beatrice Grady Hale had found their shape. They were the homestead on the Cimarron River and the horses that ran from it. And they were the 2 children who would grow into adults who understood what their parents had built and why. And they were 12 years of mornings on that porch and evenings by that fire, and all the ordinary and extraordinary days between. They rode home to the homestead 5 days later, through the October mountains with the aspens already gold, and the sky that particular deep blue that belongs to fall in New Mexico. And Samuel rode up beside his mother on the mountain road, and asked her to tell him again about the race, and she told him, and Clara fell asleep against her father's chest before they came down out of the mountains, and Sovereign walked the trail with the steady authority of an old horse who knows every step of the way home. The homestead came into view in the late afternoon light, the barn and the north barn and the paddocks full of horses, and the kitchen garden still holding its late-season color, and the smoke beginning to rise from the chimney where Ruth Calloway had kept the place warm during their absence. Calliope was at the fence of the near paddock, as she always was when she heard the horses coming down the road, watching the road with her calm, intelligent eyes. Beatrice stopped her horse at the gate, and looked at all of it for a moment before dismounting. The land her father had filed a claim on in the 1870s, and that she had proved up alone in the grief of losing him and the stubbornness of knowing it was right. The barn he had built, and the larger barn she and Tobias had built, and the north barn that came from Meridian's foal crop. The horses that were Tobias's life's work and hers now equally. The house where Samuel had been born and Clara after him, and where there was, she knew, one more person on the way, because it was March again by her counting, which she had told Tobias the previous week with the same directness she had told him the first time, holding her coffee cup and looking at him with the alert steadiness that was simply who she was. She looked at Tobias, who was handing Clara down to Samuel and swinging off Cimarron with the easy movement of a man who had spent his whole life on horseback, and who looked up and caught her looking and smiled, which was still the thing it had always been, the thing that had happened the first time she had seen it in a barn in Cimarron in September of 1878, that quality of warmth that changed the whole landscape of his face. "Home," he said. "Home," she agreed, and opened the gate. The third child, another son, was born in March of 1891, in the same homestead house where Samuel had been born 11 years before. They named him James Theodore Hale, the Theodore being for Theodore Altman, because it was right to give that name to someone who would carry it into the future. He arrived into a household that was ready for him, with a brother of 11 who took his responsibilities very seriously, and a sister of 6 who had already, in the weeks before his arrival, explained to anyone who would listen exactly how things were going to be organized. Tobias held James Theodore the same way he had held Samuel, with that complete and careful attention in the lamplight of the same room, and Beatrice watched him from the bed with the exhausted and total satisfaction of someone who has done a significant thing and knows it. "3," she said. "3," he agreed and looked at her over the top of the baby's dark head. "You are all right." "I am entirely all right," she said. "I am better than entirely all right. I am precisely where I want to be." He came and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and held the baby between them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. And outside the March wind was coming up the Cimarron River the way it always did at this time of year, and the horses were moving in the paddocks with the particular restlessness that spring wind provoked in them. And Cimarron's son was probably pacing his fence line the way he always did in the wind, and all of it was theirs. All of it was built and tended and loved. In the years that came after, Samuel would grow into a horseman who carried both his parents' gifts, winning races with his father's horses and his mother's instincts, and taking over the breeding ledger with a thoroughness that made Beatrice tell Tobias one evening that she thought their son had surpassed them both. And Tobias said he thought so too, and that it was the best thing they had done. Clara became the rider Beatrice had always known she would be, fearless and precise, entering her first race at 14 and winning it, and going on to a career in the regional circuit that people in the territory talked about for decades, the daughter of the woman who had beaten Tobias Hale at Cimarron in 1878, which was a story that never quite stopped being told. James Theodore grew into a quiet and steady man who loved the land more than the horses, who farmed the creek bottom acreage with a dedication that turned the Hale homestead from a primarily horse operation into a fully integrated ranch that could sustain itself through the droughts and the difficult years, which was a different contribution than his siblings but equally essential. Tobias Hale turned 50 in 1900 and was still the finest horseman most people in the territory had ever seen, though he raced rarely now and spent most of his time with the breeding operation that had become one of the most respected in the region. He was a man who had built something lasting from the ground up, beginning with a conversation in a livery doorway, and a woman who had told him her name before the dust of a September race had quite settled. Beatrice Grady Hale turned 46 that same year, and was still the woman who had beaten him, which she occasionally reminded him of with the precision and timing of someone who had never once let sentiment interfere with accuracy. She was also the woman who had stood at the registration table in 1878 with $25 in her pocket and ridden 40 miles for the memory of her father, and come home with something she had not quite known she was looking for. They sat on the porch on the evening of his birthday in September of 1900, with the Cimarron hills going their evening blue and the horses in the paddocks moving in the long sunset light, and the house behind them full of the noise of 3 adult children and their various presences and the accumulated warmth of a life that had been built carefully and thoroughly and with love. 22 years, Beatrice said. From the race, he said. From the race, she agreed. Do you have any regrets? He asked, which was not a question he often asked, being generally more interested in the present than the past. She thought about it with her characteristic honesty. I regret that my father did not see any of it, she said. I regret that Theodore did not see more of it. I do not regret a single day of what we have built. Neither do I, he said. Not one. She reached over and took his hand the way she had reached across the space between their horses on the creek road in April of 1879, without hesitation, the gesture of a woman who had decided and never looked back. The sky was going from gold to rose above the Cimarron hills, and Sovereign's great-granddaughter was moving along the fence line in that particular quality of evening light that made gray horses look like they were made of something other than flesh, and the meadowlarks were singing in the pasture grass, and somewhere behind them in the house Clara was laughing at something, and the sound of it carried out into the evening, the way good things carried, far and clear. Tobias Hale had been the finest horseman in 3 territories. He had held that distinction with pride and had carried it alone for years, and then in September of 1878, a woman on a bay mare had crossed a finish line ahead of him, and he had asked her name before the dust settled, and it had been the best question he had ever thought to ask. Beatrice Grady, she had said, and she had been right about every single thing after that. The porch light came on behind them, warm and yellow, and the first stars appeared above the hills, and they sat together in the way of 2 people who have earned their quiet, with nothing unresolved between them and nothing left to wish for that they did not already have.